Welcome back. I hope you had a good tea break. Before we do our energy theater for our last experiment, we want to draw a free body diagram or force diagram. So I want you to make a very simple diagram. Draw this to represent a monk sitting on a skateboard. Don't draw anything more complicated than this. Don't draw any of the monks. This is the only objects you need to draw right here. Okay? For your experiment that you did in your group, draw the force diagram. So starting with this diagram, start drawing arrows and labeling them, I don't know, to represent the different forces. Okay? Yeah? So go ahead and do this in your notebook, in your own notebook. You might even want to make a list of the objects that are interacting with the object that you're concerned about.
Right now, we are only thinking about the forces that are exerted on each system, not the energy story. After we think about the force story, we're going to think about the energy story, and we will combine.
Okay, I see many of you have nice little drawings in your notebook. I'm also happy to see that your drawings are getting bigger too. That's a good thing. Because as you get older and you look at your notebook, you won't be able to see anything. So group one looked at two different masses of monks. Big mass monk? Little mass monk. Let's call always the monk that's on the cart will be Tashi. This is not the same because this is Tashi.
So that's Tashi.
Well, this is you're Jamyang? Jamyang? And what is the small monk's name? Gyaltsen?
Gyaltsen.
All right, so we have Jamyang and Gyaltsen. Okay, so what are the forces? Let's start with Jamyang. What are the forces acting on Jamyang and skateboard as one object? First, what are the The first thing we should do though, let's remind ourselves what are the objects interacting with Jamyang and the skateboard.
Ta thangbo gozu du gala shuga mandrung la ngobo khari khari phensu dewa du la jora jan da skateboard dingam de ngobo chigra khorani khorani nyam du phensu dewa chinge ngobo khemba khari khari dos. The earth say kola che ni floor shala di che ni darshu la thinking midi the one who is pulling
the one who's pulling. Okay. Can we assign a name to the monk that's pulling? We'll use the same name in each scenario.
Dila duda thanda thingi kusho jiyor lara dinal ngoboji koral ming ji shagos and ming di thangmal jibo shay thagaran shay is ming khari shagesa thingi dila Tenzin.
Okay, Tenzin is pulling. We'll remember that.
The thingi ming shawlo do ta Tenzin shas thingi di.
So what are the forces acting on Jamyang and his skateboard?
Ta jayan da thanda kholo jiya skateboard digal ani shu khari khari gaya res Tenshu gravitational force.
So there's a force of gravity. It's on Jamyang
Di tenshu di jayan galo yorwas.
by the earth.
Gyage say kola di che.
Right?
Rosa di.
What else? What other
Shemba
forces are
khari
there?
res shuk shemba. The frictional force.
There's a frictional force. I'm not sure how long to draw this arrow, so I'll leave it without an arrowhead.
Ta darshu yor lara. Di shuk tsuyagi da di ani thanda godi thig me stringlo khabas thigu me ha gung dusra.
What is causing this force?
Ta di shuk gyange su cha de res. Khari gi gyange res shuk de jangal. Shala floor.
By the floor. It's a force of friction on Jamyang by the floor.
Di jangal darshu gyange di ani shala di cha de ras.
What else?
Ani shemba khari res. La. Ya khachu gore. Ya bije jage res sugi shalagi. Force by force on Jamyang. There's a push on Jamyang by the floor.
Which direction?
Khandire yare upward force.
Okay. Is that equal to the gravitational force by the earth?
Ta ya bugur le jora se kule thinshu da chikpa roesadi. Yes it is.
So I'll draw the arrow the same length?
The ringdung chikpa thiga sa gang jungi. Yes.
So that's the force on Jamyang by the floor.
Ta di Jamyang gala ni shalagi ya shuk gyu de roas ya ta gyud.
Can I just call you Jam?
Kerala jam lana digresa. Yes, you can call him Jam.
No, Jam, like peanut butter and jam.
On just say Jam yolas dirulan digoralas.
That's a good nickname. I think it might stick. What other forces are acting on Jam?
Jam gala shuk shemba khari khari gashas. There's a pull by Tenzin on Jamyang.
There's a pull by Tenzin.
Yeah, Tenzin pulls Jamyang.
And I'll draw that like this.
Thank you, Ladu remove the Tia Rasa.
And it's a force on Jam by Tenzin.
Di Jayangala shuk gaju di Tenzin gi shuk yagin di chadu ras.
How big is the friction force on Jamyang by the floor compared to the force that Jamyang is being pulled by Tenzin?
Tenzin gi Jamyang tendu shuk ji gelu ra. Di da ani darshu gi shuk ji ras. Di ni durwa ina ani khande res. The frictional force is lesser than the force on Jamyang by Tenzin.
Okay, so we'll make it a little smaller. Are we happy with this?
Yes.
So in the beginning of the experiment, sometimes Tenzin was pulling on Jamyang and Jamyang was moving with constant speed.
Thangbo gozo do gala kabre Tenzin gi Jamyang thengi yores. Jamyang yogu chi yores. Yogu che yokse di chikpa ro yogu yores. Yogu chi di.
And so when Jamyang was moving with constant speed, how did these two forces compare?
Ta tendu gala jay gyose chikrang la yogu chigyor la ra di imbai na di dani juda di ni khandesli res chikpa bugere gyose. When it moves at constant speed, these two arrows should be equal length.
Very good, very good.
Okay.
So when this is bigger than that, we saw that there is speeding up.
Da di le ringa yendu gala nganzo khari thon la na ngobo di yogro du yoras.
Let's look at Gyaltsen.
Ta nganzo Gyaltsen gala ta is.
What are the forces acting on Gyaltsen?
The Gyaltsen gala shu gyangi khari khari cha de res. Khari khari res. Khari teshu gravitational force.
Is the gravitational force acting on Gyaltsen smaller, bigger, the same as the force acting on Jamyang?
The Gyaltsen gala teshu jiyo re sung ra. Di da ani jayang gala teshu jida. Khurani chikpa re yana di la che yore yana chunga yore. Okay, smaller than the smaller as compared to
So
jayang.
I'm going to draw a little bit smaller arrow.
Di la du teshu di tis chunga yore la ra. Di la du en da di chunga tigi is jayang da durwa inas.
So the force of gravity on Gyaltsen by Earth.
That this should be say kule thin should the Gyaltsen ga ya yod de res.
What's another force?
And shuk shemba khari dosti gal. Yeah, upward force.
How long should I draw that arrow?
The gang le jo the ringdung khagas chugu res should be same as the gravitational
Same.
force.
So same. Same. Okay?
Dingi chikpa roas.
This is the force on our friend Gyaltsen by the floor.
Di Gyaltsen gala shuk gaya di che shuk gaya ani shala di cha de ras ya tangyo de.
Can everyone read my handwriting? I notice it's getting a little sloppy.
The exutis chicken saru saru do do sa.
Can you see?
Seo sig de.
Can you see?
Yala kinas gyab shunge
Can you
de
see?
sig de. Sig min de.
No?
No, they cannot.
It's okay?
La. He cannot read from there.
If you cannot see where you're sitting, please come forward. I think most people can see, so there's only one or two of you. There's seats. We'll make space for you.
Ta khashe sig min do sunge ra. Del saja tongba do del peru chi sungu dula.
Okay, what other forces are acting on Gyaltsen? Yeah.
Ta Gyaltsen gal shuk shimba khari khari yores. La. Tarshu frictional force.
Frictional force. I'm not sure how long to draw that arrow.
Ta darshu jior lara di ringdung khagas tibu me ha gu mes.
So I'm going to leave it blank. There's a force of friction on Gyaltsen by the floor.
Ta di shuk di ani Gyaltsen gal shuk gya wa che gyagen di shala di cha de res tarshu di.
So in their experiment, they were pulling with the same force in both scenarios.
Ta khonju ta ji chidu khari chewar la wa na tanda nedang thangbo da niwa do niga nan shuk khari gyar lan shuk chik pa gya res niga na.
Our last force is the force on Gyaltsen by Tenzin. Our last force is the force on Gyaltsen by Tenzin.
Ta shuk thama gya jo jora di khar la na Tenzin gi Gyaltsen ga gya jo di cha de res.
How long should I draw that arrow?
Ta o di thama shuk thama jira di ringdung khagas tibu gu res. Thoga di da chikba should be same as the force on Jamyang.
So this arrow is going to be the same length.
Di la du ringdung phai gang la khagas te on shi chikba tibu gu ras wala.
Same length. And that's the force on Gyaltsen by Tenzin.
Di shuk di Gyaltsen ga la gya wa che gyagen Tenzin di cha de ras sujo di.
We need to decide for our frictional force. How long should the arrow be?
Ta darshu jira di gal ngara ju thaju chibu gu ras ta di da di ringle khagas tibu gu res darshu di. It should be small.
Small compared to what?
Chunju gor thundu gor sung ra khari da duru ana thundu gores compared to the one on top.
To the one above. Okay, so this arrow is Jamyang. So you're saying that Jamyang experienced more of a frictional force than Gyaltsen.
The Kiranzo share gang dilla tunga gorlara. Dilla dugala jayan the duru aina gelsin la darshuk nuats tayo landishi ras, yes.
Okay. So I'll draw an arrowhead there.
Dai godi pata gashi insra.
Please, everyone should be copying this into your books as we go along.
Tango zinda du gang la karbang la tida. Di Kiranzo tider na tigi nyam do naro chis.
If you need to move up, please move up. Don't be shy.
On the gap the sigmeo and Kiranzo guji do la pero chisra. What's how maris?
There's only so close I can get to you.
The dilil ha the nyeru tang thue mendusa. Dil.
Can you still see?
Kiranzo sig this.
Okay. Really? Okay, group 2. Well, group 2 investigated the same mass, so these two objects are meant to be the same mass. But they pulled with different forces. So for this first experiment, what should I label? What are the forces I should label?
So it should be same as the first one, except that there's a difference in forces.
Okay, so we're going to say that this is still Jamyang sitting on the, this is still Jam. Okay? So he's saying that the force of gravity is the same as in this case. And so that length of the arrow is the same. So there's a force of gravity on Jamyang by the earth. It's the same strength as the force in this case. There's an equal and opposite force from the floor acting on Jamyang. There's a friction force, and they said that this is the same. And then there's a pulling force. But we don't know how long that is yet. And this is a force that's on Jamyang by who? By Tenzin. Tenzin. Right. How does this scenario different from this scenario?
So it should be, there is a difference in forces, that's why the length of the force should be different.
Which force? There's 4 forces, which arrow should be different?
This way.
This way. So,
and also he said the frictional force will change.
I'm going to, just to save time, I'm just going to draw the arrows without the labels. Is that okay? And then I'll do this. So in this case, they applied, in which case are they applying a bigger force?
Above, the one above has more force.
The one above has more force. Which scenario is going to have a greater acceleration?
The one above.
Which one will take the most time to get from the starting point to the ending point?
Ta thangbo gozu to ni man ne zosa jura zamshasa di paral thuzu gyuringa sui seires khandi gi seires ne dang thangbo de first one will take more time. Some of them are saying the lower one.
Which of these will take the most time to go from one place to another place?
Ta ne chik ne shemba la dura di duela thuzu manga khandi gorgu res. Odi one below.
The one below. Yes.
Res.
Okay, so that is group 2. What about, yeah, please.
One idea that I heard is that these two frictional forces are different. We have not done experiments to decide if the forces are different, the frictional forces are different on an object that is moving. It turns out that once the object starts to move, the frictional forces are not different, but we do not have experimental evidence for that. We have not collected it that. So this is chikpa, that one.
Last group. So they measured they investigated how the angle affects the motion. What the normal forces are not equal to the weight now. What forces should I start to label on this diagram?
Okay, one gravitational force.
Gravitational force? Should it be different from the other gravitational forces for Jamyang or the same?
It should be the same.
So same. So far all these arrows are meant to be the same, but not that one. So it's the force of gravity on Jamyang by Earth. What other forces should I look at?
Frictional force.
Frictional force. And this is the force of friction on Jamyang by the floor. We'll give that an arrowhead in a second. What other forces are acting on Jamyang?
Okay, there's a force by tenzin on Jamyang.
Okay.
Jamyang is pulling tenzin.
Let's make this case where he's pouring horizontally. Okay.
And that tenzin gi giant thing your lajura this should be any tailor ras come to think your.
Any other forces?
And it member shuk shimba your west. Okay, there's an upward force.
There's an upward force, and it's equal to the downward force.
What
is causing this upward force? Or providing it?
By floor.
Right. So we have our 4 forces. How does the length of this friction force compare to the force that tension's pulling?
Frictional force is smaller than the force on Jamyang by tenzin.
So I'll put a little arrow here. What about this case?
di the da di ringa gugu res. Ali yeah, okay. So the force on Jamyang by Tenzin should be up.
Okay, so in this case, the force on Jamyang by Tenzin is like this. Okay?
Dinde gugu res rasa that di should be.
What other forces are acting on Jamyang?
The di mayin be shuk shimba khari gya res chayangan. Chikpa shimba. Rest all forces are same.
So the rest of the forces are the okay, so I'm just going to draw the arrows.
Sangma shimba sangma chikpa res sungdu ni da chikbu thishi yins.
Are you guys happy with that?
Di digi doasa da chikbu yashangana.
So only difference is the direction.
That gyua chikran juras khari gyua di kharla na cho di khajo di gyua ras.
Am I missing anything?
Chikma sama do lagyo do du estina. Khandi. Del angyo chi. There's one more force over here.
Okay, what is that?
Anu di shuk di khari res. Del angyo shuk chi yore shera. Shuk di khari res. Emory. So this force is the force opposite to the frictional force. There is an opposite force to the frictional force, so which goes this way.
And is that part of this force?
That handa darshula dog bechi gyore shera. Di chashe chagi yorues di shuk di chashe rues. Re. Now. Di shuk di chashe rues del chig yore shera honde. Kharan re chig bare lagore. Chashe re mare khare. Okay, there is no force over here.
Okay. But they're actually, maybe if I don't know if I understand what they're getting at, but I think they're getting at an important idea.
The kenzo khare shiya thanda yabu shema so dusta du samlo na lada kenanzo ni du kechimbush do de series.
So I'm going to give you credit for it, even if you're not.
The kenzo la dia angi do te in sa kenanzo ta samlo di tangi na re mena re.
So one way to think about this force is that it has a horizontal component and a vertical component.
Ta thanda dil cha shoina dupcha ro shoina chik thela yo che chik shungla yo ti shi yo ros.
And the way we can draw that is we can make a triangle. So this is the horizontal component, and that is the vertical component.
The dupcha ro ke je shoina thela chik da shungla chik yo res. Thela yo di thanda di cha de res shungla yo di res.
So when we think of this force, we can actually remember that part of it's in this direction and part of it's in this direction.
The dishu di samlo tang waina digi chaji su thingi yo ro che chaji ya thingi yo ro dinde ligi res.
Are we happy with vertical forces?
Ta thanda shungla shukta gya shado di digi dues. Khandi di Gandhi. So this should be longer.
This should be longer. I think that Bryce drew it the same size as this.
Dustana Bryce ki di jura Gandhi the chipo thios res ring
So it should be the same size in the two situations.
Cheza ani nedang ni dos nigal chipo gugu ros.
Can I ask a question?
Kyanzul thios tangasma.
If Karma Sunu stands on a scale,
Ta digal nga langwa inas radi chise dil tani.
and I pull up on her,
Ngi ya themba inas
will the scale have the same number?
an ma jigo ta jura dila angi chipo thingi ruesa thingi rues. Jigo ya jura dila da gang ni Bryce ki thendi ra dil ta du gola ni jise the scale way scale you're talking about, right? Jise kya hai jura dila angi chipo thingi rues jise chipo thingi re thing mares gang ni thendi na.
No.
Yang ro dures it will weigh less.
And if Karma Sunu stands on a scale and I push down on her, will she weigh this? Will she have the same number on the scale?
Jise kya yoje juya digala nga ya lang chara ni price ki nemba inas kang ni ra ani jise di chikba thungre kha kheba dure khar chigres it will show higher.
So in this scenario, you're pulling up on Jamyang.
Ta nedang dido cha sha inas ra dinal kharir lana kirangi jawe thingi yorwas.
Right?
Roas ani.
So does that affect any of the other forces on this diagram?
Ta di thingi yorla ra dila de digi ani thanda di rimuna la shugin tigi yorwes kheba do stu res shugin yore dina. Yes, it affects this diagram. Say attention kheba do res. It affects the gravitational force.
Oh, so let's think about that.
So he's saying the frictional force will be less.
Okay.
There's no change in gravitational force, but the frictional force change.
So right now, the floor has to push up on Karmasundu.
Ta thanda khara churla na shala digi malaya bugu ras bugu res.
She is interacting between the earth, and there's a gravitational force pulling her down.
Ta ngar khari da phenju dewa chadirla na se kola digi thenshu digi ma thingi res.
That's between her and planet Earth.
Dila dugala suda su chadirla na ngada ni se kola phar di chadir res.
I can't interfere with that.
Di parala ani bryce ki pharzang ya dende yungu yoma res.
But I can make the floor have less work to do.
In the
sense that if I pull up on her, now the floor doesn't have to push up as much. And if I kept pulling her up more and more and more, then there would be very little force from the floor pushing her up.
Dilo di gang ni khagas ki manga the oi nas price ki ani digas ki thanda shala ya bue jora ma cha du res.
So as I was pulling on him, the pillow did not need to push as hard on him.
Ta thanda pe sha nas tamaris ki kela thin so ya thendu gala di wall shubdin digi shiras bugu yo mares thembe ka.
So what arrows might change length with this information?
Ta thanda nisu dura di nisu ragyo dinene ani ta di gyo khari tang bugu res diagram model. Khandi di thong ro res. So this should be smaller. Khandi di thishu darshu this ko rere chininda chike one. Some of the monks said this should be smaller, and some are saying this should be smaller, and some say this should be smaller. The raw, some may this muda kashi di kashi ma kashi pajo di darshu di sunse. Kandi nyung rutu. Di, and di kare chung rutu. Okay, this should be smaller.
Okay. How many of you think this arrow should be smaller?
Oh, the kiransu nanglola di daji doa di chunga gugure sami khazuyes.
How many of you think this arrow should be smaller?
The kiransu nangni di dadi chunga tunga gugure lain khazuyes.
How many of you think this arrow should be smaller?
The di chunga gugure samge.
How many of you think this arrow should change?
The di dadi gyo gugure samge khazuyes.
Can somebody explain why they think this arrow should change?
The kiransu tanda di dadi gyo gugure shingi jora kharching gugure reslan di tishish kya das.
Let's working?
Tanda di ya thien dila chaji ya chachi su thingi dus.
Wait.
So he's saying like if this arrow has 3 parts, one part goes this way, another part this way, and so the forces are divided. That's why this should be smaller.
This should be smaller. So this arrow, let's remind ourselves, this arrow just represents the number on the meter.
Di da jik doa, di khari chungor launa thana ngazu di ta duga le yilo yo shu khaga sime di chungyo res.
Right? So whatever that number is whatever that number is.
The number di thana angi khari thyoba di thagaran diga lada ringdung di se jora shu gi se di kwesha res.
These dotted arrows just reminds us that some of that force is in a horizontal direction and some of that force is in a vertical direction.
Di khari tensu la chedu shower la na di shuk jora di khashi shugi chaji khol yor la na chod di jo duyo che chik ya duyo di tensu ta chedu ti jo res.
Remember, if this arrow and this arrow are the same length, then the net force in the vertical direction is 0. There is no movement in the vertical direction.
Di dai ringdung da di chikpa tiwa inas sangshu khar chai lana lego chai roas di la du shung la yugo chi re lana chi mares shung chol ta ina ba.
But if some of this force is in a vertical direction, right? Then all of a sudden the net force in the vertical direction is not 0.
Di la du ya thingyo jora thanda di thing da surgu jigal di gi cha ta shu gi cha ji ya cho thingyo la inas ya cho di phar gi roas and di la du gala thanda changshu di lego ding marwas.
In their experiment, nobody was flying off of the ground and into the air.
Di la du ta je shidu gala thing ro di ya surgu ji du gal ya nam la ya phur re din de yung mundas.
So we know that the net force in the vertical direction has to be 0.
Di la du gala ani changshu di lego gugu roas.
The gravitational force does not change.
Tenshu di lo joyo mares.
So the only thing that can change is this.
Ta joyo joyo la jora di khari joyo la na di joyo joyo res.
Somehow I lost a pen. So this has to be smaller.
Ta khari chunga gugu la na da di chunga gugu res.
Yeah. And over here, he had an idea about the frictional force. How might the frictional force change in this scenario?
It will be smaller.
It could be smaller. Why might it be smaller?
The chunga kharchim gugu resti. Hari re.
What do you say?
Hindi. So when this person pulls from this angle, when Tenzin pulls from this angle, so there will be some space between the wheel and the floor. It creates a gap in between these two, some space. Shala kya shuk di chung ro du dar shuk di chwa du res. When the force by the floor on this on Jamyang becomes less, frictional force also reduces.
Okay, I like what you're saying, but I don't think there was a space created between the wheels and the floor. I think Jamyang was always on the ground.
The kyan su samchu di sheju di yagu do sine dil motu mesa dini para tongcha ji chagir la jora di mes tongcha soin ba mola soin ba mola yang ro dures dese di yang ro dures di kya du gala dese di yang ro dures. Okay, so he's saying I didn't say space, I meant that the mass becomes less when something is pulled from this angle.
So this is you're getting at a very important point. The mass is still the same.
Ta kenjo samju kech mushi dula sine dese ma chagir la di chagyo maris rangja res la jise Okay, there is a change in weight.
Can we say there's a change in the downward force?
Ta nganzo dende lana digi roesa ma ge shuk jura dile gyo dure lana digi roes ma shuk di onde chungro dur odile gyo dur lana digi roes. Yes, we can say that.
So let's say there's a change in the downward force. The downward force.
Ma ge shuk jura dile gyo dur lana digi roes.
And it's a little bit less.
Ta onde nyunga yore shuk di nyunga yore lana la ma ge shuk di nyunga dugu chungro dugu res ani dar shuk di chungro dugu res. So when there is less downward force, there is less frictional force.
Do you guys agree?
Mutun US adila.
Uh-oh.
He said no, he's giving him back.
So that is correct. When there is less downward force, there will be less friction.
Demba resti khailan mal ge shuk jira chunga yo na dar shu ya chunga yo resla.
Remember, in this case, it wasn't because Jamyang had more. It really wasn't because Jamyang has more mass than Gyaltsen that there was more friction between Jamyang and Gyaltsen.
Tanda di Korani ki darshu jdo Jayang dose che Gyaltsen dose chunga chi di kengi darshu kheba dre di mares.
It's because there was more of a downward force for Jamyang compared to Gyaltsen.
Tanda di kharchin chagi ur lawa na Korani ki ma ge shuk jora ma shuk de ni Jayang da Gyaltsen ni durwa na Jayang ga ji ma ge shuk di che res.
Because if I was walking behind Jamyang and just holding him up, and I would be making the downward force less.
Tangi Jayang gabla ya lang ni Jayang tis ya them bai nasra di ani Jayang ki ma shuk ge jora di ma chagi res.
So in this case over here, as they say, if you're reducing the downward force, then the force of friction will be smaller.
Di la dungi ni sho na shi ma ge shuk jora di ma cha wai na ani digi tanda darshu di ma chagi ur lan shi res.
So these are 6 force diagrams for the 6 different types of experiments you guys did.
Ta di shu ki remote thuk di cha de res kiran zo ne dan tru yora dinam. Di Tenzin gi shu ge jora di shu ge bai nasra jise di churu durwes. So when there is okay, he has a question. He said when Tenzin pulls Jamyang, so during that process will Jamyang weight less?
So we said that the word weight for us was equal to the gravitational force of the Earth on Jamyang.
Tatana nganzo jise la jora di thangi di kharil khugur la hoina Jamyang kala se khole thenshu khagas kya ime jora dil khugu roas thenshu dila.
The gravitational force that the Earth exerts on Jamyang is the same whether Jamyang is standing, whether he's lying down, whether he's sleeping, whether he's in the water, where he's jumping up in air, where he's falling. The gravitational force is the same.
Ta thanda thenshu jora Jamyang kala kya thenshu di Jamyang ya shang de na re ma de na re ma nye wa yo na re chuna yimba na re chong de na re nedang khande je ne thenshu chikba cha de re.
Je de ane dada je de ta kar se Jamyang te kal ma yara ane bol bol te ja ane ya koi na.
Please collect the microphone from them when he's done.
kilo na ja na thamu khora kilo ma ju na ko me ji ki ya the unde ane khora kilo chun ro da te unde ko chun ro de ji chun ro re.
So when Bryce holds Jamyang, on weight scale it will weigh less. So does it mean that can't we say that his weight is less? It has reduced?
No. What reduces is not the gravitational force on Jamyang by Earth.
Ta di chung ro dwe jora. Di thanda nganzo tenshu di jayangal tenshu gyagyo di chung ro dwe lagi yo ma res.
That force is dependent on the interaction of two objects, Jamyang and the planet Earth.
Tanda shuk di shigura. Di su da su pargi tewa yo keji shigur lawaina. Jamyang da nganzo sa se kula dingi pargi keji shigur res.
When Jamyang takes a child on his shoulders, the Earth still pulls on Jamyang with exactly the same force.
Ta Jamyangi pumba gala puguji shawa inasra. Di shadu gala Jayangi tenshu tawa in say hola tenshu jora Jayangal gyawadi. Di tawa in tenshu chibuji gyan res.
When Jamyang is in the swimming pool, the Earth is still pulling on him exactly the same.
Jayan chu gesar yo chu nang yo ne. Ni thanda sai tenshu tharan chikba di res.
When he jumps up, the gravitational force is the same.
Jayan chung wake up suye kui tenshu tawa ina tenshu tharan chikba res.
When he jumps off the stairs into the courtyard, the gravitational force is the same.
Tanda deni ni ma pang chola chung wa ina is Jayangi tanda tenshu say kole tenshu jora Jayangal di chibuji gyan di res.
What changes is the force that his shoes are exerting on the floor below.
Khari duo duo lawaina kora hango gi tanda shala gala shu gya jora dil kheba du res.
That is not his weight.
Di kora jigo di chagi yo ma res jise di.
So that is the force due to touch.
Di khari chagor lana rek bekingi shuk jitungi ora di res.
The weight, we defined weight as the interaction between the planet Earth and an object, and that does not require the object to be touching the Earth.
Di ladu tanda se kule tenshu le jora. Di ladu khari da khari penju dewa chagi la na se kule da ngobo chik pargi ke je shigi res. Di ladu inji menji penju dewa ladu kuni re bugu yo ma res di ngobo ni di.
Does everybody have these drawings in their notebook?
Di remote chazan kiran zo tideb na tisa imbes.
Can you
Yes.
show me? Hold up your notebooks.
Tideb inde tero chida surprise la yakyan.
Well, that would be a good photo.
Par gain sada. Yakya da sa par gain sada.
So a week ago, I don't think many of you had any practice doing these kind of drawings. A week ago, I don't think any of you had this kind of practice doing these kind of drawings.
Tenzo di remote di chel jongdar mangbu gu do asa.
So I think you've had this experience yourselves. When you make these drawings, you really have to think about what's going on.
Di la du kiran zo remote thiwe kapso jongdar thiwe kapso samlo nal tang gu khig do asti nal khari chungshim bare lan tin samlo tang yu ros.
So we have a couple of days left. I encourage you to keep practicing these kinds of drawings.
Di la du ani kiran zo remote di khang mang mang jongdar nang ro ches.
We're going to move now to creating the energy theater for Jamyang being pulled by Tenzin down a hallway.
Ta thana zo nibe thapden jua di ani jamya la tenzin gi thanda di zo di dingja sta dinin ma thing
You
yu
want to
di
do these
res.
two? Small force, big force? And we want to do group 2's experiment for our energy theater.
Ta zo thanda nibe thapden jua ruha niba ni gu yus.
So that means the only difference, remember, is the force that's being applied by Tenzin on Jamyang.
Ta dila kheba khari dugor la ina khuran nal jua khari tang sher la na tenzin gi jamya the jura shuk di kheba jo do res.
Remember, different places on the floor represent different objects.
Kyan zo thing do asa thanda ne loga loga yora shale di ne de zo khari chungor la na ngobo minda chungu ros.
I should use the word stage instead of floor,
Ta shala peju chigi me la shala ye chabla ni dingja lan peju chigi is.
because one of our objects might be the floor.
Khan sana ta manju ngobo chig shala chagi yora chezan shala la du thugu dos dingja lagi is.
So our theater begins when Tenzin starts pulling,
Ta zo di thabden di go chu di khari chigir la ina tenzin gi the go chu gu res.
it continues as Jamyang is pulling Tenzin along,
Ta di mutuni ten di gu res tenzin gi jamya.
as Tenzin is pulling Jamyang along,
Tenzin gi jamya ten di gu res.
and it ends when they cross a finish line.
Dila dugala ta thama khadu chabdun de jam khadu shagirlana nejli ra de thik de le dugala jam shagires.
Remember, places on the stage represent objects, not physical space.
Ta thanda dingja thanda chabdun chigra digapso dingja digi ne loga khari chungir lawaina ngobo dinju chungires.
So you'll need to decide what places on the stage represent different objects.
Dila do ta dingja inne khari ngobo khari khiranju chunje chiya khiranju thaju chugures.
You'll have to decide what forms of energy you will be and transfer into.
Thana shi susu nube ngo khari na yo ani khari ngo shimba khari le gyurgu di sama thaju susu na res.
And for this, can you work in your same groups you use for when you do whiteboards?
Kinzo karbang tel ruga soy ba thanda di chibo chikyan ruga na nangro chesra.
So maybe six people per group would be nice. No more than 10 people per group.
Dila du ruga chikna mi thuk sam chagi orwas. Chule manga masuro ches ruga chikna.
And no groups less than 5.
Thana shi ruga chikna le ya minga le nyunga de masuro ches.
Okay?
Seo chase.
So go ahead, meet and decide your energy theater.
Ta nube thabdun jora kiranzu na indu kiranzu khandes nangi me di kiranzu thaju chiro ches.
Can we decide as a large group what objects we will pick so that we all pick the same objects?
Ta ngara zo ngobo dame imba inas thabdun chi ngobo dam gora ngobo khari damgi is.
What objects are important in telling the energy story?
Ta thanda nube thabdun gi rung disha ura di shedu galan ngobo khari khechumbu chagi yores. Dina ta waina khari shala the floor shala di che ni the wheel, the skateboard wheel.
So we will treat Jamyang and the skateboard and the wheels as one object.
Ta kinzo kholo shira skateboard che kholo che an thang shi jamyang ni sum ngobo chik chigi yes. Ngobo ke shi wor thandra ngobo jamyang she so da jamyang the skateboard chik race ani shala an shemba Tenzin. Okay, the one who is pulling Tenzin.
Tenzin, yes.
What does he say?
Kela khira khari su imbes. Gujo jagen jahen ro thanda. Inde su imba. Shuk dang niba. Nuba da shuk sung imba. Shiba da shuk sung imba. Shuk sung imba. Gujo ki khari shuk ra. So can we say that there's a force on Jamyang and there's an energy associated with the moving object and there's a force associated with moving object. Are these two same or different?
So there is a force on Jamyang by Tenzin, by earth, by the floor, and the frictional force by the floor.
Ta Tenzin Jamyang galu shuk ge ta waina chik Tenzin ge jayore chik shala ge jayore chik se khole ge jayore chik thanda darshu dirwas.
So there are 4 forces on Jamyang, and those forces are interactions between Jamyang and the other important objects in the world.
Ta thanda shuk di ta waina phinjun dewa ga ta ge yores thanda phinjun dewa su da su chagir lana Jamyang da ngobo shemba de chu chade yorwas.
So those forces are like handshakes between Jamyang and other objects.
Ta di shuk de zo ta waina ngon zo lagba inde chik thamgi ya di rores Jamyang da ngobo shembe phargi di chade yores.
But energy is something that is in Jamyang.
In a nuba la jora di Jamyang khoron nanglo lo yo dinde chik shigi yores.
Or energy is something that is in Tenzin.
아니 누바 텐진 코르셰와이라게 텐진 코랑기 낭라 누바요 딘디식시요레스.
Or there is energy that is in the floor, as we saw first thing this morning by the energy theater of the group.
대한나시 응원이 쇼게 딩전나 탐 탑된 시원나시 한다 샬라갈라 누바요 샬라나 누바요 레주라 디도 차요레스틱.
Yeah. Are there any other objects? We have the floor, Jamyang, including the skateboard and wheels, and Tenzin. Are there any other objects?
따단당 아주 모보거 시도갈라 직 샬라디 차데레 직 잠양 레스 직 텐진 레스 모보 셴바 요 레스 디 마이베. Earth.
The earth. Any other objects?
아니 셴발 하드스 모보 셴바 요 레스 디나.
Lung, air. Anything else?
아니 디 마이버 셴바 요 레스 모보 셴바 요 레 디고 마티와. 카리레 탁바. Okay, the rope or the string.
Let's conclude that with Tenzin.
onda kisu thakba da then jura di ani tenzin nyam do chi shanasa So his question, he has a question. He said, why these two frictional forces you have made it equal? Why these two are same?
Why these two frictional forces equal?
Yeah.
Because the frictional force, as Brycela said earlier, depends on the force that the object and the floor, the vertical forces that the object and the force are exerting on each other.
Ta thanda di darshu jura di dilara lu yura sa thanda ngobo digi shalal ma ya jo de shala ya jo khurani para shu jura dilara lu yura sa darshu di.
Because these are the same, these are the same.
Ta nedang di da dini ga la darshu chikba thanda di gang da wo jda shung le jo shu di chikba tendu wala and di darshu di an chikba chayu res.
I apologize, we have not done that experiment to convince ourselves that the forces are equal.
Ta gonda sa khaila na ngaranzu rangi susu rangi tache chinita thanda darshu di chikba rela ni ngaranzu itaje chitu yo maresti.
And for the same reason, because these two forces are not equal, these two frictional forces are not equal.
Thanashi di shungni di chikba chai mundas cheza ani darshu di lai kheba du res.
Let's agree that these are the 5 objects we will use for our energy theater, and that means there'll be 5 places on the stage representing these 5 objects.
Ta thanda nganzo nubet dungjura thabdu nangla ngobonga tön shasra ngobonga yodugala dingcha gala nenga sugu ras ngobonga di chela.
Your theater does not necessarily need to use all 5 objects, but this is your menu to choose from.
Ta ine keranzo thabden shidugal inji miji ngobonga ja sugu yorela na di mare sine damba ina dinzo yores ngobo.
If you have any more questions, call us to you and we'll come answer them.
One additional thing, let us actually decide as a large group what might be the forms of energy that might be relevant in this situation.
Tanganzo thanda nedang jera digi nanglola ani nube gi ngo nube rik jera rik khari khari dinal chugi yores jawa chagi yores. Nuba khari khari jawa chagi yores adina zegi nuba chemical energy
Okay.
Oh, chemical energy. Would you nuba kinetic energy?
Kinetic energy.
Would you nuba che ani khari chugi nuba thermal energy?
Okay. Okay, so let's go out then. We have decided on the objects. We have decided on the forms of energy. Let's go out and try it out.
No, we're not going anywhere. Sit in your group and discuss.
Tangazo ngobo damchara ngobo digi yores lani shesares thana shu nuberi khari khari lana kiranzu shera nuberu de rasares ta kiranzu nanglo di chodur na ne chabden di bor chodur nangro ches.
Okay, go for it.
Go zuru na chodur che.
Time for chemical energy. So you can have kinetic energy, so you can walk back here. So you can provide thermal energy to make this room warm. I hope your chemical energy is delicious. And we will see you at 2 p.m.